Hi, everybody. This is Vasudev, and welcome to another episode of the That Depends podcast, where we break down Indian legal realities. Today's episode centers around Supreme Court litigation, and to discuss this important issue, we're joined by advocate on record, Mr. Talha Abdul Rahman. He has over a decade of experience practicing before high courts and the Supreme Court, and is well versed with the ins and outs of Supreme Court procedure and how cases get to the Supreme Court. As always, I'm joined by Resha, who's going to walk us through what today's episode covers.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Why this discussion about Supreme Court is important is because we look at the Supreme Court only as a court that protects our fundamental rights. But that's not really the true case. The Supreme Court has various other rules that it has to fulfill. And that's why it's important to discuss these rules and the challenges that the court faces. Another important aspect is the qualms we have with the Supreme Court is because we only perceive it as a court protecting our fundamental rights. But that's not, like I said before, it's not the true case. It has various other duties, and we have to see what those duties are and why are they also important. So thanks for listening, and hopefully you guys like this episode.
So first of all, thanks so much for being here with us, sir, and sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom. So I think the first thing to really understand the Supreme Court is to understand how cases get to the Supreme Court and what kinds of cases the Supreme Court actually hears on a day-to-day basis. So could you just walk us through what the sort of broad basis of jurisdiction are in terms of how cases get to the Supreme Court and what kinds of cases these actually are?
So I think in order to understand what kind of cases get to the Supreme Court, you must understand who brings these cases to the Supreme Court. The cases to the Supreme Court fall in two categories, essentially in two categories. As far as litigants are concerned, one will be the appellate and one will be those pertaining to violation of fundamental right. And a lot of people argue that the role of the Supreme Court is appellate and there must be another court of appeal between the High Court and the Supreme Court. Now, what happens is that the law provides for an appeal to the Supreme Court. For example, if you look at the Consumer Protection Act, it has an appeal to the Supreme Court. If you look at the TRI Act, that will provide an appeal to the Supreme Court. So various statutes over the years have conferred a statutory appeal to the Supreme Court. So that is the core appellate function, and those are, the appeals as of right that come to the Supreme Court. For example, I file a consumer complaint in the National Commission and I lose. Then I am the one who's wanting to challenge that appeal. So I will bring a matter to the Supreme Court. So from my perspective, I will be the appellant. Now, the law, the Supreme, because the rule of law requires that a person should have at least one appeal on law and facts. So for that purpose, the statute says, all right, from an original complaint of the National Commission, you will have one appeal to the Supreme Court. So the Act provides for an appeal to the Supreme Court. So there are certain statutory appeals which are provided as of right. Now, that is one part. The second is because of the way the Constitution has been structured, it provides any person to approach the Supreme Court from any order. So if you look at the wordings of Article 136, which is the most used provision for an appeal, it provides that any person aggrieved by any order. So even if you are aggrieved by an order of a Tehsildar, of a district magistrate, you can straight away come to the Supreme Court. Now, looking at the background of it, you see, we have been subjugated for years. So, when you get to make your own court, you say, all right, I will make a court of appeal, or I will make the tallest court in this country, which will allow the poorest man in the remotest part of the country to straight away come here and knock the doors of justice. Now, that's the kind of vision that the Constitution had. And that is why, 136, any order can be appealed against. And same reason, Article 32 is engrafted, which, really provides anybody aggrieved by violation of fundamental right to come to the Supreme Court. So that's why I said, you see, you have to look at it all of this from the perspective of who has to come to the Supreme Court rather than what will travel to the Supreme Court. Now, people may say, you see, this is a frivolous case, that is a frivolous case. I mean, I have a separate understanding of how these frivolous cases arise. What happens is you go to a trial court, the trial court doesn't give you relief, doesn't appreciate your arguments are not written, you don't get proper lawyers in the trial court for whatever reasons. I mean, I'm not blaming the lawyers, I'm not blaming any particular system, but I'm saying, this is the reality. Half of your arguments are not recorded, half your arguments are not even developed by the courts below, and then the matter reaches the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will say, look, you have not taken that plea, you have not done that, you have not done this. The judges have, not exercised their discretion properly, or worse, there's a concurrent finding against you. Two courts have held against you. Why should we interfere? That's the worst question that falls from the Supreme Court very often. And the answer is really because the underlying systems are bad, that a person is compelled to the Supreme Court. So, I mean, you see, nobody wants to spend money if given a choice. 136, you come to Supreme Court because you lose in the High Court and you don't see any other remedy. You say, all right, let me take a chance in the Supreme Court and see if, maybe the judges there are more learned, maybe the judges there are more empathetic, maybe they understand what I want to really say. I mean, that's the kind of relief that you're looking at.
Yeah, I think, sir, what the important thing to understand is that for the person who's the litigant, for him, his case is always right. Like, he's not looking at his own case with the respect of this legally is it correct or not, because he himself feels he's the correct party in this whole dispute. But how you said in Article 136, what happens is that from any order you can come, and anyone can come, the poorest person from the remotest corner. But we usually don't see that happening. And that's also a very important part of how the Supreme Court functions, is the limitation that the Supreme Court in itself has due to the system it has put in.
Well, that is true. And that's a reason to encourage or, have a proper legal aid system, have mohalla clinics, provide a system of access in the remotest part. So, for example, somebody in, say, Odisha wants to approach the Supreme Court, has been wronged, and he says, "Nahi, mujhe Supreme Court pe bharosa hai, main wahan jana chahta hu." And he says that. And there is no medium available for him. There is no local legal aid clinic. He can't go to a district court there and say, I want to go to the Supreme Court. So the legal aid system expects him to travel to the Supreme Court for him to seek legal aid from the Supreme Court. That's the way legal aid structure. So the legal aid structure also has to be revamped, but that's a separate issue. Now, you're right that a litigant may say, "Nahi, mera case hi sahi hai, what I'm saying is correct," and that's the final point. But you see, he also understands that the final arbiter is the court. And the person should have a right to pitch his case at the highest body. So I wouldn't take it anything lower than that. You see, you have to also understand the way systems are going to function at the lower levels. You have a small case at a lower level, you will try and quote unquote manage the system. You don't have faith. So you will look for lawyers who have who can tinker around. I mean, these are all realities. So what you do is you say, all right, I have no remedy left, I'll go in appeal. And then in appeal, you don't get a relief. Your arguments are even not recorded. Your evidence is not appreciated. And that leads to the perversity of the order. And there has to be some forum to challenge it. I mean, obviously, that leads to a flood of cases in Supreme Court. But that's what the courts are for, I mean, you have a large population, there are bound to be a large number of cases, and you have to have more lawyers, more judges to deal with those cases. You train them better. I mean, my personal feeling is that one of the reasons why a large number of cases actually travel to the Supreme Court is because there's poor training in the courts below. I mean, you've seen that Goa judgment in Tejpal's case.
Yes.
The other party could have been the appellant. I mean, I'm not saying it will end at that, but look at the reasoning. I mean, and these are trained judges, and you are able to, the whole country is able to, look at that judgment threadbare, because it's a huge case. I mean, it's Tejpal case, but before this case, the same judge would have decided hundreds of cases. In future, he's going to decide 100 of cases. So there is evidently poor training. You have High Court judges sitting in states asking, the rape victims to tie Rakhi and do things like that in bail applications pertaining to rape. So, would you not have, a Supreme Court to correct those errors? So I'm just saying these are things that get reported now.
Yeah. So I think it's absolutely correct, because based on my limited time at the Supreme Court also, we all have seen some horrific High Court orders, some horrific lower court orders. I think the flip side of this entire issue is that at the end of the day, we only have about 30 odd Supreme Court judges. And if we have so many problematic orders coming from the lower courts and the high courts, we need a really good system to make sure that the most egregious cases are heard, or the cases where we need to correct the law are heard. So could you just talk about the way in which the Supreme Court decides what cases it's going to hear, in terms of what the standard is under, say, Article 136, which is the discretionary relief that litigants use to come? And also, I've always been curious about, when you read older Supreme Court cases, they talk about the certificate of appeal from the High Court, and whether that system is still in place and how effective it was.
So you see, when it comes to the appellate, so we in the initial part I mentioned that the Supreme Court is appellate, and it's also trying to give a remedy to those who complain of violation of fundamental right. When it comes to appellate jurisdiction, there are statutory appeals, whose examples I had given. Then there are appeals by certificate, which is that the High Court certifies that it involves a substantial question of law or substantial question as to interpretation of the Constitution, and then it comes to the Supreme Court. And then the third, which is the special leave to appeal, where you don't need any certificate, you straight away make an application to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides whether it involves a substantial question or not. So, recently in my 10, 12 years at the Supreme Court, I haven't really come across certificate cases. Maybe one case arising from Bombay, but apart from that, I haven't really come across any certificate cases. There may be hesitancy on the part of lawyers also to apply for those certificates in the High Court, because you see, you are basically telling the High Court judge that I am going in appeal against you, and you certify that it involves a question, and I will take it to the Supreme Court. Maybe that's the reason, or maybe it's a procedure that is not used as much. Third thing is, when the appeal comes to the Supreme Court lawyers, them asking the High Court lawyer that you go make an application to the judge to grant you a certificate under 133, 134, 132, whatever it is. That's a tedious process. So, people don't want to spend time in that process. We don't know, but you see, it is for the Supreme Court and also for the High Courts to encourage. If High Court also feels that, this is a case where both sides are likely to go, either side is going to go in appeal, and it does involve a question, then you have to, give a certificate in case a party wants to go up in appeal. So it's for the High Courts to encourage that system. It's for the Supreme Court also to encourage the High Courts, encourage the lawyers also to get that certificate. Now, but that certificate, like the correctness of that certificate, like the correctness of the order, is not a guarantee that the certificate is correctly granted or otherwise. So it may be, I have had cases of interesting questions of law where in that Bombay case itself, where, the certificate was actually refused. So somebody applied and the court refused. He said, no, I don't want you to go to Supreme Court. I will not grant certificate. You go. So then, what did the guy do? He'll file a 136 and say that, look, I applied and the court never granted it. Or, the application to seek those certificates is pending for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's faster to just go under 136.
Yeah, it's faster. Definitely. How 136 operates, I think part of your question was...
Yeah, I think that's what...
136 operates.
Yeah.
Maybe the way I understand 136 is like, imagine Supreme Court to be a physical location. You are permitted to come in the premises the moment you file a 136. But whether or not I will allow you entry to my private room will depend on whether you have a substantial question of law or not. So when you file a 136 petition, you are inside the premises of the Supreme Court. That is to say, you will be heard whether or not you should be given access to my private room. In the private room, I am going to then decide a question of law. So you explain to me there is a question of law, there is no question of law. And if I'm convinced at whatever stage, it can be first hearing, second hearing, or even at the last hearing, that there is a question of law, I will let you into my private room, which can also be called a privileged room, and then you get in. So 136 entails two process. One, that you satisfy the High Court, Supreme Court, that there is a question of law that is to be decided. Once the Supreme Court agrees with that, it will let you in and then decide that question. But if it doesn't agree, the SLP will be dismissed at that stage. It can be on the first day, it can be after hearing the other side, it can be even after hearing for 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months. It depends.
And could you, I mean, we have all been in the Supreme Court, but could you describe for our listeners and ordinary non-lawyers what sort of Mondays and Fridays are typically like in the Supreme Court? How many cases are heard, and how long the Supreme Court actually takes to admit a matter or not admit a matter?
All of this, varies from judge to judge, really. I mean, ordinary cause list will be, say, 35, 40, 45, often goes up to, say, 51, 52 also, but that's rare. And judges read up the file, the lawyers then argue their cases. Now, some judges are, are more prone to admitting the appeal. So they think that, one side has made a substantial point of law, or the impugned order has something tricky which the court needs to decide, or is going to have an effect on other issues, or, two high courts have taken a conflicting view. Then they will admit the appeal on that day itself. Some will issue notice, but by and large, Mondays and Fridays are essentially slaughterhouses. I mean, most matters will get dismissed. Unfortunately, what happens is, and it's a rare art, once you read the file, it is not possible that you don't make a view. I mean, you make up your mind. Notice karna hai, isko dismiss karna hai. So, I mean, some of the judges, I had the privilege of, assisting Justice J.S. Verma in the Verma Committee report. So, he told us that, it was very difficult to not form a view, because, you've gone through the impugned order, you've looked at the grounds, you've looked at the facts, and then, you're trained to, take a view whether this is to be done or not to be done. And then you reach the courtroom, and the lawyer, you've already sort of taken a view, this side, that side, or maybe you're sitting on the edge, and then you look at the lawyer to make that point. So that's why, it's more difficult, and that's why people say that Supreme Court practice is in touch and go, because the judges have read the file, you have read the file, you've got about 30 seconds, a minute, maximum 2 minutes to, make your point as to why, judge should not decide the way he has decided. Because otherwise, if he's made up his mind that he's going to dismiss the case, is nothing.
But so that's the thing. If your whole case revolves around 30 seconds to 1 minute, and you have come to the Supreme Court thinking it's the final adjudicator of my rights, so we know it's just 30 to 1 seconds because it's been decided at so many levels. But still, it feels a bit, you feel that you've been shortchanged, because you only get 30 seconds, like a litigant in his end only gets 30 seconds to actually do what he's come to the Supreme Court for. Like, someone's come from the remotest corner, like you keep on saying, and he only gets 30 seconds to make his case. So it's very difficult for them to understand what just happened. Like, why did this happen with me?
That's true. And that is why, you see, that is why you have have a hierarchy of courts. You get maximum time at the lower court, and then lesser time at the high court. And at the Supreme Court level, it's not that the judges, are dismissive. Most judges, there are exceptions, of course, with, all of us know of, but most judges will have read the file. They will, despite having formed a view, they will allow you time to convince them otherwise. Or some judges will also tell you, look, there is a point against you, which is on page, say, 24. please explain this. And if you're not able to explain that, then they will say, look, this is the point against you. This is how your conduct has been. This is how you made an admission, or you have not said this. This is a technical issue. That's how. So I mean, judges are well prepared, and most judges of the Supreme Court, you see, have practiced for a long time, so they read much faster than others you would estimate. And then you've been judges for several years, so that makes a lot of difference. I mean, for example, several sitting judges of the Supreme Court, they, even as lawyers, they used to read 15 briefs, 10, 20, 10 briefs a day. Actually read, not like a junior making a note. They will read it themselves. Junior is only there to aid them, but essentially it's their reading. So once they become judges, they're used to finding that one page in the entire 300-page file and saying, look, this is what your question of law is. This is where the point will turn. This is how it is to be pitched. And some judges are very kind. They will also tell you that look, what your point you are arguing is not the greatest point in your case. The greatest point in your case is this. You've not argued this, but since you've taken it below, we will issue notice on that point. So it's really a booster for the younger lot, because you don't have the same kind of vision which comes with experience.
Right. So, and I think if we move on from 136, if, like you said, the Supreme Court admits the case and you're sort of invited into the private room of the Supreme Court for them to adjudicate your dispute. We know the admission, you said, sometimes can just take 30 seconds to a minute. But once cases are admitted, how long does it typically take for a Supreme Court to go through its entire hearing process, then final hearings, and then actually pronounce a judgment or dismiss the case?
It can be anything between a week to 10 years. The statutory appeals filed in 10, 15 years ago have not come up for hearing so far, because but it also happens that you file an appeal today, it is admitted, and the court then expedites the hearing. It is listed the next month, and then parties also cooperate, and then the matter is heard. So it really is.
Are there any sort of key factors that determine whether a case is about 2 weeks or 10 years?
Well, the question of law, two, the implications of that question, and three, of course, whether the judge wants to hear it. It may involve a very trainy question of, say, Mitakshara law, and he may not be wanting to decide it in that one case. But that is something that, it's an important question, but he doesn't want to decide it in that case. Or, he feels that this is not a question that will be useful for people at large at this moment. So it is left to be decided. Sometimes, for instance, a service matter, whether a particular person should be granted seniority or not. So that person, for that person, that's the most important case, and he may be able to show rules, conflicts, how this is to be interpreted. So they say, all right, we will, since now that you've retired and we have to also hear your case because it's an important question, we will, admit the appeal and hear you, say, in 3 years, 4 years. And then, parties sometimes also make an application for early hearing, and they set out reasons. So, depending on the reasons, court also says, all right, early hearing application is allowed, list after 2 months. So that sort of a thing. So there is no set rule, but of course, judges' own interest, the implications of the questions of law, things like this, essentially.
Yeah. So this, I think this is a nice segue to the second part of what the Supreme Court's power actually are, because we are seeing that at the appellate side, it may take 2 weeks to 10 years, and it has this flood of cases, and it's a slaughterhouse on Mondays and Fridays when these cases are to be heard for the first time. But there is also another role that the Supreme Court has to do, which is the constitutional role it has, which we just discussed briefly in the starting. This is Article 32. So among this Article 32, which is protection of the fundamental rights, where does Article 32 fit in this whole puzzle of the Supreme Court then?
So, first of all, I wouldn't make such a neat distinction between appellate powers and the fundamental rights provision, because I don't see the appellate power any differently. When I say differently, I mean that once, for example, if you are um, appreciating, for instance, an issue of illegally obtained evidence or forced confession in a criminal case, you are eventually insisting upon a constitutional guarantee that must be followed. So even in that appellate function, the Supreme Court is performing a constitutional role. So there is, I wouldn't make such a neat distinction, but I get the drift of your question. You see, the Supreme Court had been contemplated as a forum for direct access. So whoever is able to approach the Supreme Court with a grievance that fits within the frame of 32 must be, in my opinion, must be granted access to. I mean, so the problem with the Supreme Court is Supreme Court thinks that, will open floodgates, everybody is going to come here. I mean, I understand in some situations the High Court may be better suited, but as a person who's a litigant, as a citizen who's been guaranteed a right under 32, it is not for the Supreme Court to say that, look, you will be better suited if you go to High Court. I mean, if he has come to you and there is no disability otherwise, you must hear that person. So, I mean, I take that view. But having said that, you see, for example, local issues, the Supreme Court may not be in a better position to appreciate that. So, for example, if you want, what example should I give? For example, you see, if you say that you want to raise an issue of a public interest pertaining to, say, illegal taking over of, say, ponds or small river bodies and things, then maybe the local High Court is better suited because, it appreciates the conditions, it appreciates the local administration, the local requirements better than the Supreme Court. So in that situation, it may be better suited. So, I mean, it's a very thin line, but in cases of personal liberty, at least the Supreme Court should never say that, you go to High Court and file a habeas corpus there, why have you come here? I mean, it takes a great effort for anyone to go to any forum. And if the person doesn't want to go to High Court for whatever reason, don't make him spell out those reasons to you. I mean, the lawyers may not be comfortable in spelling those reasons out for whatever reasons, but these are the judges who are appointed by your collegium. I mean, if a person doesn't want to go to them, it's fair enough. The Constitution allows him to come here. Let him choose his forum. Let him choose his remedy.
Right. And so, just in terms of there's one question is the 32 aspect of it, like you said, enforcement of fundamental rights. But like you mentioned, that there are also other cases that could have constitutional implications, whether they come under 32 or 136 or a statutory appeal. They could implicate serious constitutional questions. And at least as far as the text of the Constitution goes, it says that these important constitutional questions should be decided by a bench of 5 judges. Now, I just want to understand, given the fact that the Supreme Court spends 2 days a week, Mondays and Fridays, just hearing admission matters, whether or not to admit these 136 appeals, how really feasible is it for the Supreme Court to get through all its constitutional questions, forming benches of 5 judges? Because as soon as you have a bench of 5 judges, you've taken out 5 judges from your appellate function, right? So how really feasible is it for the Supreme Court to actually carry out its constitutional functions under the current scheme of things?
Well, so my reading of that provision is not that every issue where some constitutional issue is, raised has to be referred to 5 judges. For example, whether a person can be detained without being brought before a magistrate within 24 hours. Well, it is a constitutional issue, but it will not arise. This will not require reference to 5 judges because it has been decided. So a large number of constitutional issues that are, raised in a large number of cases can be handled by 2 or 3 judges within the parameters of the law that have been laid down thus far. And in appropriate cases, the Chief Justice may then, constitute a bench. But you're right. I mean, disproportionate focus on those cases does affect the appellate functions of the Supreme Court. And in some cases, even in the appellate function, you will require 5 judges to decide an issue. I mean, your land acquisition, the compensation issue being one of those, you need a reference to a larger bench, whether it should go or not go, I mean, how the judges distinguish the existing 3 judges, I mean, these are all issues, everybody is saying, it has to go. So, I mean, these are all not really constitutional issues. different benches taking different view within the realm of the statutory provisions. So what I would respond to that is simply by saying that yes, it does take away time from the appellate function, but laying down the law for the guardians of the high courts, the district courts, and the smaller benches of the Supreme Court, that's also a very important function. So it really depends on what are the questions that are pending, and again what the Chief Justice has decides. I mean, it's really the wisdom of the Chief Justice, because then he's the master of the roster. He is to constitute benches, and he will then take a call. We know whether this case is something that decides needs a decision immediately.
Then I'm saying the interesting bit is it's all the perspective, right? So it's even the wisdom of the Chief Justice in his perspective. What's the role of the Supreme Court? Does he like I made that neat distinction? Does the judge himself makes that neat distinction in his head that my work is actually appellate and I'll focus more on this part of the court, or my work is actually more constitutional under Article 32 for that matter, and I focus on that. So it's really the perspective of the court in itself in a certain specific time frame is what is guiding how our rights will be affected, and by rights I mean appellate rights and constitutional rights.
Yes, of course. I mean the way your Chief Justice or any Chief Justice thinks does affect how the institution is going to function. I don't think we can shy away from that reality. The way your judge also thinks will defend whether he'll go on the majority or a minority. That's why the constitution of benches is also a very important function. Who's to sit in which bench? I mean, a lot of people have written about judicial processes, and so you guys are aware of that. So, but yes, of course.
Yeah. No, I think this has been a fascinating discussion, because I think you have really been able to highlight how the problem is not solely on the Supreme Court side, but there's a larger structural problem beneath the Supreme Court. So a lot of criticism comes to how the Supreme Court handles, say, constitutional benches, Article 136, but it's part of a much larger structural problem in the lower courts. But given the fact that this episode is on the Supreme Court litigation, could we just wrap up by maybe, if you have any suggestions in terms of structural changes to the Supreme Court itself, what do you think is the biggest problem facing litigants, or from your own perspective as lawyers, one structure within the Supreme Court that could immediately be changed without too much fuss?
Reformed. So maybe reformed. Change is a stronger word, I feel.
No, I mean, I really believe that the change, if you want, change has to come from the bottom. And I mean, the Supreme Court gets very, pained that, usual small bail applications are coming to it. Why should the Supreme Court of India decide bail applications? That's because the lower courts below are not applying the law that has been laid down. So, that's the real problem. The courage that should be there at the lower judiciary is not there. I mean, they're succumbing to pressure. The High Court says, look, the trial court has appreciated your case and not granted it. We won't grant bail. Another person has to come to the Supreme Court. Or, worse, granted bail in a case where it should not have been granted. That's why one has to come to the Supreme Court. So the problem really with the Supreme Court, and that's really the point of reform, is that the Supreme Court must ensure that its orders are complied with. Otherwise, it's just a paper Supreme Court. And that's also, really...
The thing is that because sometimes, for example, I don't practice in the Supreme Court, I practice mainly in like my local High Court. Sometimes the perspective also is that the orders passed by the Supreme Court or the decisions taken by them to improve the lower judiciaries is so disconnected to what is actually happening in this place. So their orders aren't enforceable. They can't be followed because the perspective of the Supreme Court judge and trial court judge is so different, and there is no gap, there's no bridge between them. That's
that's why you see the way Constitution is designed, it doesn't give Supreme Court any power over a district court.
Correct.
District court is within the supervision, within the eyes of the High Court. And the High Court is really, the karta dharta of the lower judiciary in the state. But what has happened today is that the Supreme Court, you're supreme because, the appeals lie to you. Otherwise, you're not supreme. You're co-equal with the High Court.
Exactly.
So, but the point is, in trying to unify the judiciary, a lot of problems from the local courts, the solutions trickle down from the top, but the problems don't travel from the bottom to the top. So, I don't know, we are tinkering with the constitutional scheme without, ensuring that the conversation happens both ways. And most of the judges and lower bar may not be in a position to, say really anything to the Supreme Court. I mean, this new proposal of, the vision document about technology. I mean, that's problematic at so many levels. You're unifying the police and local judiciary up till the Supreme Court. You're putting them everything on one server. Trying to give access of, for example, one of the things it promises is that the judges will get access to the FIRs that are there. But what happens to the supervision of the investigation? I mean, that's the core function. The problem is not with the access. If the magistrate says, Mr. SHO, please get me a copy of the FIR, get me this document, what have you done, bring me your case diary, which SHO is going to refuse that? But the problem is the judges are not, doing that.
Exactly.
And the High Court is not impressing upon them to do it. And the Supreme Court is simply saying, look, there's a lot of problem. We need to do something, and we need to therefore catch hold of the district judiciary. I mean, get them to do it. So the problem is Supreme Court laying down beautiful laws, wonderful laws, but it's not being implemented on the ground. Get them to implement it. Lynching, for instance. I mean, Supreme Court has, a judgment on lynching, laying down so many guidelines on preventive, restorative and curative steps, but nothing is being followed. The matter has not seen light of the day for 2 years now. And the High Courts will say, look, matter is pending in Supreme Court. We won't do anything. Supreme Court is not enforcing its own orders. So if the Supreme Court doesn't enforce its own order, whose dignity suffers? I mean, it's the Supreme Court own. The biggest reform that has to come from the Supreme Court is ensuring compliance of its own orders. And that's true also for the High Court. A large number of contempt petitions are filed, and only after filing of contempt petitions does a compliance of the court order take place. Why should a man have to go through filing a contempt petition, which is another round of litigation, adding to the litigation burden, to get an order of the court complied with?
Yeah.
If you punish 1 or 2 people, send out a message, that if you don't comply my order once, I won't let you sit here, I'll send you to jail.
Yeah.
You do it to one person, the entire department is going to fall in line. But it's never done.
Thank you so much. This has been a absolutely enlightening discussion for both of us, and hopefully our listeners as well. I think you've really given us a bird's eye view on a lot of the problems facing both the Supreme Court and the entire judicial structures in India.